Welcome to Journaling with Nature, the podcast for those who want to turn curiosity into wonder, a pencil sketch into a rabbit hole of discovery, a moment of stillness into a life full of joy. I'm your host, Bethan Burton. Let's open the pages of our nature journals and explore this world together. Hello, this is episode 57. I'm smiling from ear to ear to be sharing this interview with you today. My guest, Brenna Quinlan, is a super inspiring person who's making change through her art and illustrations. Brenna is a permaculture illustrator who uses art as a form of activism, engaging with big topics like politics, overconsumption, and the climate crisis, but always with a solutions focus, and viewing her work will make you smile and want to jump up and do something to make a positive change. In our conversation, we talk a lot about permaculture, and if you're not familiar with what permaculture is, it's a system of integrating land, people, and nature in a way that ensures each part of the system is cared for. A permaculture design will work with the land and the non-human living beings to make the most efficient solution to a problem. So instead of doing a whole lot of digging to prepare a garden bed, you might let your chickens spend some time in there to scratch around and loosen the soil and fertilize it at the same time. Or it could be that you place a rainwater tank uphill from your house so that you can use gravity to get the water to your home. So permaculture aims to find solutions that are efficient and sustainable and that integrate living and non-living elements together in a very practical and elegant way. In a permaculture design, you place your veggie garden close to the house so that you can easily step out the door and grab a few herbs for lunch. And permaculture can be practiced on the balcony of a city apartment just as well as anywhere. You definitely don't need to live on a huge property to practice the principles of permaculture. Brenna's illustrations embody the solutions focus of permaculture and are designed to get us thinking and engaging with these important topics. In this conversation, Brenna talks all about how focusing on solutions can bring about happier, healthier, and more resilient communities. Let's listen. Brenna, thank you so much for being here with me. I feel very, very excited to chat with you because you are definitely one of my huge inspirations.
Thanks, Bethan. It's so nice to be here.
I'd like to hear about your early experiences of nature and art. Are they both part of your early experience?
Yeah, so I've always been an artist of sorts. Since I was a really small child, I loved to draw and I loved to paint. And I mean, most of us do when we're kids, but yeah, it was my passion and my obsession. And somebody told me once that I was allowed to study art in high school and then could actually study it at university as well if I wanted to, and that art could be a career. And I actually thought they were joking for a few years. It's like things that are that much fun can't be work. It can't be legitimate, surely. It's like saying you can eat ice cream for a job. But yeah, here we are. I eat ice cream for a job, so to speak. I get to draw every day. And as far as nature goes, I had a very suburban upbringing. So everything that I know now about permaculture, about providing for our own needs, about ecological connection and literacy are things that I've come to appreciate later on in life. I mean, I was always intrigued, but I've definitely been able to learn more about those as I've started delving deeper into the permaculture and sustainability movement. So I hadn't planted a single thing until my 20s, and I'm currently in my 30s. And I'd never been on a hike until that age either. I'd never been canoeing. I'd never camped overnight anywhere. So I had a very different childhood from the kind of lifestyle that I live now. And I think it's given me a greater appreciation of how, wonderful that connection with nature can really be.
Yes. I wonder if you can tell the story of how you came to permaculture.
Yeah, sure. So after university, after I studied art at university and journalism, I did that cliched Australian thing where I took off overseas to find meaning in life. So I got a one-way ticket to India, and after a few months there, ended up in Canada. And that just started off this whole kind of life-changing phase of my life. I rode a bicycle from Canada 11,000 kilometres south to Panama, over the United States, through Central America. And we didn't have fancy gear. Our bikes, with my partner at the time, and I purchased our bikes for about $50 each from the Canadian version of Gumtree. We just had one pair of shoes that I got from the op shop, and we were camping every single night and, you know, meeting people on the way. You're quite vulnerable as a cyclist, I guess. You have everything on the back of your bike, and people can see that and they relate really well to that. So that's where I started having these really deep conversations about climate change, about social justice, and the journey I was on started to deepen. And by the time we got to the end of that trip, I guess my whole worldview had changed after seeing, you know, real poverty, but also real land-based cultures in India, and then hearing the North American perspective as well. So I decided to start volunteering on properties that accepted volunteers that were doing great things in the world, trying to meet their own needs in the best way possible, and that were caring for nature as well. And that's what led me to permaculture. I'd sign up for a volunteer place and they'd say, "Hey, have you heard about permaculture?" I'd say, "What's that?" And they'd say, "Oh, it's this great thing. Here's a book, and come with us to a meeting, and here's a person that knows all about it." And yeah, for the next 4 years in South America, I was volunteering, learning about permaculture, and then eventually took my 2-week permaculture design course. It's an international course offered in thousands of places around the world. Millions of people have done this course, and it's a real game changer for most people. It certainly was for me. And after that, I started teaching permaculture in Latin America too.
Isn't it wild that you came to something that originated in Australia in South America? Yeah,
it was really funny actually, because some people in those circles would see me and say, "Oh, you're Australian, you must know everything about permaculture." And I'd have to say, "Oh, I'm still learning." I mean, we're always still learning. But we'd hear all these names of, you know, David Holmgren and Bill Mollison and Jeff Lawton, and the big names of permaculture were all Australian. So when it came time for me to come back to Australia after 6 years overseas to be a bit closer to family, I was pretty excited to meet some of these heroes. And Bill Mollison sadly passed away in late 2016, the day that I touched base back in Australia. But David Holmgren is definitely very much still alive and actually went down to his place in Victoria, paid to do one of their monthly house and garden tours, met him and his partner Sue, and asked if I could live there. And so I've spent the past 4 years living at their wonderful permaculture demonstration site in Victoria, and I've actually just moved out. So it was a really great time. Learned a whole bunch, and yeah, I love those guys. They're like family to me now.
That's amazing. And it was actually them that launched you into your current illustration career. Do you want to tell that little story?
Yeah, so I guess all the years of volunteering and then, you know, teaching permaculture, practicing permaculture over in South America felt quite profound and like, you know, I was doing something really important. But then the kind of pub test of that, I guess, is when you talk to your grandparents at Christmas and they say, "Yes, but what are you actually doing with your life?" And I wasn't sure of the answer, but I knew that something big was happening.
Yeah.
So I just kept telling myself, you know, stick with it. There's no real going back. Once you kind of break out of the norm and once you start learning about these things, you're on that path. You can't go back to a mundane existence. You can't go back to the normal life before. Ignorance was bliss, but it's gone now. So yeah, I was just trying to maintain that confidence that some sort of career path would open up, I guess. And I mean, I was living at Meliadora, working 6 days a week as an intern, kind of investing that time in exchange for education. And it was pretty cheap as far as education goes, much cheaper than my 6 years at university. But it also wasn't paying any bills, which I knew I would probably have bills at some stage in the future. So the whole time that I was interning there, which was a total of 4 months, David Holmgren was talking about this new book that he'd been working on. And he'd spent years putting it together. And it was called RetroSuburbia, about how to live a regenerative life in the city or the suburbs. And they'd have these huge meetings at the lunch table, all these, marketing people, the graphic designer, the people booking Dave speaking tours, the Brains Trust who would check all the facts. This huge team would always be coming around to our place, and I'd try to listen in at the edges about this exciting new project, and hopefully one day I'll own that book. And then, after a few months of me being there, they needed an illustrator, and David asked if I would illustrate his book, which was just about the coolest question anybody's ever asked me. So, of course, I said I'll give it a crack. And that was, until that moment, I'd honestly never considered illustration before. I'd worked as an artist, and I was exhibiting and mainly honing the craft of portrait painting and watercolour. But illustration, I realised, was something that I'd been doing in my notebooks and on post-it notes and in my journals and diaries since I was really young. I just never had a word to put to the concept.
Yes.
So it opened up a whole new world for me, and that was a big break I've been waiting for. This opportunity fell into my lap that combined permaculture, activism, and visual arts in the form of that book, RetroSuburbia.
Yes, it's an amazing book, and I bought it after I heard about it from you, and it's very big. That's a very comprehensive piece of work, isn't it, for the author and for you?
Yeah, there's over 130 illustrations there, all hand drawn. I didn't know a stitch about Photoshop back then. And they say it's kind of like 3 books in one. It's divided into the built, the biological, and, excitingly, the behavioural field, which is how we can all make the world a better place, even if we don't own land or have a garden. But each one of those is kind of a book or a course in itself.
Yes. And that's the thing about permaculture. I think a lot of people sort of, gardening comes to mind when you hear about permaculture, but it's so much bigger than that, isn't it? It's a philosophy.
Yeah, it's interesting because it changes depending on where you are. So in South America, where I was first learning about permaculture, the overlap really lies with natural construction and also with intentional communities. And a big part of that is that a lot of my South American friends, parents and grandparents, still live in urban houses with traditional roofing, with traditional guttering and water harvesting techniques. They are still much closer to land-based peoples than the dominant white Australian culture is. And so it's not such a leap, I guess, to be thinking more about communities, to be thinking about multi-generational families and living a more, in a lot of ways, sensible existence. Whereas Australia, for the most part, and of course there are huge exceptions to this, but the dominant Australian culture can be, it's like permaculture's been shifted into this corner where it can be a middle-class part-time occupation. So if you have lovely gardens, and Australia has the most popular gardening shows in the world. We also have the most cooking shows in the world. So I'm not sure what that says about our culture. I guess we have a nice climate, so we like to be outdoors and then we like to be eating in the evening. But that's kind of created fertile ground for permaculture and gardening to be linked here. But it's not always the case. Every country has their own spin on permaculture. And really it's a life philosophy based on holistic design. So that's making sensible decisions about land, about communities, about our lives, based on all of the information available. And it's a life philosophy based on ethics and principles. So they guide us to do our best to make the world a better place. And of course, a big part of that is growing our food and meeting our needs in a way that regenerates the land around us.
That's so interesting what you said about community living, and I often think about this because I live in a community myself of family, but there's 11 of us here. There were 10 until a couple of days ago, and I've just got a new niece. But I really strongly believe that, especially in times of crisis like we're in at the moment, being in a community just gives us so much more resilience. It gives us so much more support through these difficult times.
Yeah, so where I've moved in Western Australia is actually to a small town called Denmark, right down on the south coast. And in this town of 2,800 people, there are 7 intentional communities. Can you believe that?
Wow.
So it's we've bought a quarter-acre block of land in one of them, and there's 18 house lots there, 44 acres of forest. Land is very affordable, maybe a quarter of the price of a quarter-acre block somewhere else in town. And I'm just so excited. I've lived in community since I was learning about permaculture in South America, and then at David Hongen's property, Heliodora, there were 3 households there. So we had a little micro-intentional community going on there as well for those few years. And now we're stepping up into a bigger, more official community and planning the children's natural playground at the moment. We have monthly meetings where we put our dreams into practice. We have working bees together. We're having an Equinox communities meet up next week with music and activities for the kids. So it's just such a lovely way to live. You know, some people talk about self-sufficiency, but really what we try to aim for in permaculture is community sufficiency. I'll grow the pumpkins, you keep the chickens, and we'll swap pumpkins for eggs, because no one person can do it all. It's much more achievable if we work together.
That's so powerful. I love that. Community sufficiency. I think community is just such a huge thing. I feel like recently I was going through like this period of feeling really heavy with what's going on, just feeling really quite depressed. And I just made some little changes, and one of them included, intentionally engaging more, seeing friends more, and it's just helped so much. I think we are social animals, and we have to remember that. We're not designed to be in these little houses alone or in pairs. I think we will be healthier the more we go towards that.
Yeah, and it's been proven again and again that in times of crisis, in times of difficulties, the best buffer you can put in place is community connection. And if you're not such a social person, it can be as little as getting the phone numbers of the elderly woman down the street to check on her in a heat wave. We just recently did a letterbox drop saying, "Hey neighbours, this is who we are. If you ever see us while you're walking the dog, give us a shout, give us a wave." It can be engaging in community groups. Maybe there's life drawing in your town, or a community garden, or a repair cafe, or something exciting like that. And just knowing a few people around, so that if there's a blackout and your water cuts out, or if it's too hot and you're worried about your or your friend's health, there's somebody to call. If there's a fire and there's no phone reception, you can duck next door and check if they're okay and make a plan. And really, it pays to invest in these sorts of bonds before the disasters happen. I've been in a fire situation before, and I was so grateful to know those around me so that I could check on them.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, one of the permaculture principles is use small and slow solutions, and we're facing so many big problems in the world, but I love this idea of just making those connections ahead of time, and that is, it doesn't feel like an enormous thing. It doesn't feel like I'm getting prepared for a pandemic, but it really is a small solution that's going to help with a really big problem, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's more important than, growing food or buying solar panels or any of that sort of stuff as far as disaster preparedness goes. But also it makes your life much more enjoyable for now. There are so many interesting people around us, and I know before I went overseas and had my kind of big life change moment, I lived in a small unit block in the city in Wollongong in New South Wales. And I lived there for 2 years and didn't know the names of all 8 other unit block livers right next to me, my 8 neighbours. I knew the name of one of them, and he moved out, and that was it. It was it was hard to live that way. So I'm much happier now, having discovered that a smile and a few words can go a long way in helping to break down those barriers. And everybody's happy to make a new friend, even if you like to be at home more than you like to be socialising. It still feels really good to meet some new people.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So you're sharing illustrations each week on social media about climate solutions, all this stuff we've been talking about, permaculture, social justice, sustainability. And I'd love for you to talk about art as activism, art as a form of activism.
Sure. I guess when I was at university and studying art, it kind of set me on this path, right? To be successful as an artist, I knew that the goal was to hone my craft, to be represented by a gallery with a good reputation, and then to have my works exhibited and hung so that people could pay lots of money for them. And that was the goal. And art is a low carbon activity generally, and art does contain meaning and beauty, and in a lot of ways it's the glue of society and the way through which we understand the big issues. But the kind of path that I was on just wasn't, it's no longer enough by my measure for the current crisis that we're in. There are so many big issues that it felt like a bit of a cop-out for me. So when illustration cropped up in my life as an option, I realised, wow, this stuff's really powerful. It's been well researched and documented that illustrations light up certain parts of our brain. They tap into emotions, they tap into our memory centres. So we can actually convey information visually in ways that we can't do through audio or through text. And a lot of information that's very valuable is conveyed in those ways, but what illustration can do is complement what others are doing. So it can bring a book to life. It's also inherently shareable. So in this age of social media, for better or worse, you release an image and it can go out there to millions and millions of people in a matter of minutes. So I took a hold of this, and it's been it's kind of the way I think anyway as a visual learner, that if I hear something that resonates, I need to bring it to life in a visual way. And as I started doing this about important issues, I realised that other people really need and resonate with this as well. Because it's one thing to be told about how scary climate change is, or how scary COVID is, or the big social justice issues and deforestation and ocean acidification. These are huge issues, and we hear the facts all the time, but hearing the facts can be quite disempowering and actually the opposite of motivating. Whereas showing that in an image with a bit of humour and some colourful and accessible characters that are quite expressive can be motivating. So that's been my goal. That's my form of activism. Taken what I love, what resonates with my worldview, and I've just started doing that for the cause. And I'll tell you, it brings me so much happiness and meaning in my life. It's what I think about when I'm going for a walk. It's what I think about at 3 a.m. when I can't sleep. It's just kind of added this extra exciting dimension to the way that I live.
I 100% agree that this is such a powerful thing, and I think there is so much power in the way you do it because it's joyful, and even when you're tackling tricky subjects, it's joyful. And you have 2 different styles. You have sort of a realist style, and you have another style that has these gorgeous cartoon style characters, and I think the cartoon style really helps balance the heaviness of the subject. Is that a deliberate choice? Is the cartoon style a deliberate choice to balance the weight of your subject?
It is. There's a reason that we see political cartoons and not political photographs in the big newspapers. Yes. There's a reason that a lot of picture books are in a cartoon style and not in photorealism. it's cartoons allow people to exaggerate certain facial expressions, certain body languages, features, and also, colours and proportion, and change things up in a way that makes the image more engaging, more enticing, and more relatable. So people are much more likely to pick up and look at an image for longer that is done in a less realistic style. And when that's combined with humour or with a play on words or with, a catchy song tune that's had the word shifted around, something like that, it can kind of talk about the tough issue without actually naming the things that make it scary. And that's one of the most effective ways to get people thinking about the issue, acting on the issue without feeling crippled by the issue, without feeling like there's no hope.
Yeah. And do you find the process is positive for you? I'm thinking about activism as a pastime itself can be really heavy, and a lot of activists get burned out, they get overwhelmed. And I wonder if the illustration has its own uplifting effect to you. Is illustrating its own antidote to you to combat the overwhelm of activism?
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, when we picture activism in our minds, we picture maybe chaining ourselves to a tree or to some mining equipment or walking through the streets with signs, and they're all really valid and important in their own ways, but they're just a tiny piece of the picture. This is a global movement that we're part of. We're living in a time of unprecedented change. People are more engaged with the big issues than they ever have been. And so what we need are people working in the hospitals to make change there. We need the lawyers, we need the investment bankers to make change there. We're seeing billionaires step up and say, hang on, this is something that I have a say in. We're seeing CEOs of fossil fuel companies stand up and say, I want to make change. We're seeing the kids of those CEOs say, Mum, Dad, what's going on? This is an unethical profession that you have. Let's make it better. So everybody has a role to play, whether you've got a job that you think is really making good in the world or whether you've got a job that you're feeling guilty about. I say toss that guilt aside and make change where you are. So if you can find what really makes you come alive, so for me that's drawing and education. For you it might be other people, or it might be your kids' school community, or it might be writing or playing music or dance. Whatever it is, whatever your thing is that makes you happy, push your weight behind that as your form of activism, because if it makes you happy, it's going to be sustainable over the long term.
Yeah, that's beautiful advice. One thing that I find powerful about your work on social media in particular is that it's shareable, and that sharing something, it doesn't take a long time, but it can spark a conversation. And I think these conversations are so important. And I was listening to a podcast called How to Save a Planet, and they were talking about whether individual action on climate change in particular is useful, or whether it has to be, big policy change and whatnot. And they were saying that the power of individual action is that someone will see you and that will spark a conversation. And these conversations are so important. And that's something that your work can do. A little square on Instagram can be shared easily, and that can lead to a conversation, which can lead to more and more and more conversations, and it spreads out like that. I find that really powerful.
Yeah, and I don't see that it's individual action or top-down action. We really need both, and they both feed into each other and overlap so much. So when I turn off a light switch for a light that's not going to be in a room that's empty, it's not really about that tiny bit of electricity that I save then. It's about a lifelong habit of being aware of what I'm consuming. And there is a huge difference between the lifestyle of someone like us in Australia and somebody, say, living in Bangladesh. So our individual habits do have a big impact. If I'm guilty of using, on average, 27 times producing 27 times the carbon emissions as a person living in Bangladesh, then that's a big responsibility on me to lessen my carbon footprint. But also, by turning off that light switch, I'm engaging with the problems. And as long as people are engaged, the top-down potential is going to be there. If none of us care, then the governments hang out with the fossil fuel lobbyists and nothing changes ever. So the big changes that we are finally seeing in corporations, in the legal system, at the government level, at the international level, that's because individuals plugged in and started thinking about this stuff. That's because we started turning off our light switches, to put it in that way. So if you're growing your own food on a global level, the carbon you're sequestering in the soil and the emissions you're avoiding by localizing your food system might be small, but we think, gosh, it's making my life better, it's making my kids' lives better. My neighbour saw me growing food and now they are, and now they've got that practice, which is great for their mental health. They've got all the benefits as an individual. I'm learning about stuff, I'm getting outside. My dog thinks it's exciting because I'm hanging out with them while I'm pruning tomatoes, whatever. There's all these benefits for us, but also the more of us that are doing this kind of activism through gardening or activism through the school system or, activism by volunteering at the soup kitchen, the more good we're spreading in the world. And these things, we can never foresee the impact that the ripples we make will have further down the chain. So it's good for us in the short term. It's great for the planet collectively. And when 8 billion people are all doing their individual actions, it actually does add up. And, it beats the alternative of sitting around and hoping that the government will get their act together. They're a very large ship. It takes a long time to turn a ship like that around. So starting small means we're influencing local councils. We're seeing that they're much more agile than federal governments, and collectively they have a big difference. So I focus on community-sized actions, and that seems to be the balance where you're impacting a lot of people. You can reduce a lot of carbon, you can change inequality around almost overnight at that scale, and it's much more impactful than just doing things myself at my own, permaculture paradise up on the hill somewhere where it's just me and my garden. And thinking community-minded seems to be a really great middle ground as far as scale goes.
I love about these solutions is that they only make life better. Like gardening makes life better, being in the sunshine makes life better, and you're doing something positive. You're being engaged, like you said, that was such a good word, engaged. And yet the benefits to your life are completely positive.
Yeah, it's, there's been decades of people being told what's wrong. And while that sort of messaging can motivate a minority of people, generally it doesn't work. We can see that it doesn't work. Being told about bad things and, especially when those issues are so big that we feel as individuals we have no control over them, can really shut people down. And so there's been study after study showing that when people are told what they can do instead of what's wrong, that people become much more engaged. And that's really what the permaculture movement has done so successfully. They've said, look, I'm going to go out and live my life in the best way possible. I'm going to meet my local farmers. I'm going to meet my neighbours. I'm going to engage with community. I'm going to engage with the big issues in a way that's really solutions focused. And that's why permaculture is so prominent. It's still a subculture like anything else. It's not the dominant culture. So that's if you're not quite sure what permaculture is yet, that's fine. But you've probably heard it bandied about a fair bit through different sources. So I'd encourage you to investigate it. It's a solutions-oriented approach, and that's the approach that I've taken with my artwork as well. And I think that's why it resonates so much with people.
Yeah, I agree. I'm wondering, so say an issue comes into your mind and you think, I really want to tackle an illustration on that. What's your process? How do you then take those ideas, take all those concepts and distill them into what's important and what will resonate on the page?
So the ideas gathering phase of my illustrating process is probably the one I spend the most time on. Every time I read a book, I mean, my library both loves and hates me because I'm that one with a huge list of books that I think they should get in, and they say, is this too niche for Denmark Library to ever lease out again? And so, yeah, leave my library with a stack of 10 books, come home, read them all, take copious notes about everything I read, every podcast I listen to, every documentary I watch, conversations that I have as well, workshops, always taking notes in these set of notebooks that I have. And then I kind of let those ideas percolate. And, you know, if I'm in the mood to draw, I'll go and I'll look through my notebooks and harvest those ideas. And then once I've got one that I'm really excited about, I'll sit down to draft out the design. And so I used to work exclusively in, you know, pencil, paper and watercolour. My mum gave me an iPad that she was gifted once and wasn't using last year, and it's been such a great change for me. The reason is because you can draw in a similar way to what you would on paper, but you can undo mistakes really easily instead of having to redraw the whole thing.
Yeah.
So I draw now on the iPad, and what I'll do is say there's a topic like local food systems, and I can think of 5 really good examples why we should engage with local food systems that make our lives better as individuals, but that also make huge change in our community. So I'll draw 5 circles on the page and then think up a great symbolic image for each of my ideas. And then I'll fit in a heading somewhere because, you know, there always needs to be text to contextualize the image. And then I draw the second draft after that. And then I'll print off the image just with a regular black and white photocopier onto slightly thicker paper, and that's what I'll end up painting in watercolour.
Wow.
So, yeah, the design of the image depends so much on what the issue itself is. And I think that's the most creative part for me. That's the bit that, you know, how do you take what was words on a podcast and an idea from somebody else's mind that was thought up in a kitchen in California? How do you take that and shift it and mould it into something that will resonate with people, I don't know, activists in Australia or Zimbabwe or whatever? Yeah, it keeps me busy, and it's so exciting when you just somehow from my own hands, sitting here on my couch, I see this image take place out of nothing. And it seems like it was always meant to be that way, but other people look at it and go, oh, I never thought of it that way. And I was like, yeah, it's just magic. You know, they say creativity just kind of circles the world as a force, and sometimes it hits you because, you know, you were in the way of it. And it feels like the ideas that I have just kind of floating in the air, and I walk in front of them and bam, we crash together and it comes out on a page.
I love that. I once went to a concert by Arlo Guthrie, and he was talking about songs just coming downstream, and he just fishes them out. And he said, unfortunately, I was downstream from Bob Dylan at the time, so he got most of the good ideas. But it must be a really powerful thing to have this idea come through you, through the iPad, onto the page, splash on the watercolor, and then put it online, and then watch it go, watch it have its own life and be shared and spread and resonate with all these people you've never met. And that must be powerful. It's something that is always unexpected, that, you know, what I create in the lounge room here by myself can kind of, you know, it's quite a personal process as well, creating an image. It's all me. There's no one else telling me what to do or fact-checking or saying, yep, that reads well to me or that is confusing. It's just, I just have a go and kind of do what I'm compelled to do without really understanding where that compulsion comes from. And
put it out there, and then sometimes I go to bed and I wake up and there's, you know, a million messages, and there'll be emails and there'll be Instagram, Facebook, and there's all this, you know, this whole storm has happened overnight, and all these people are sharing and commenting and connecting with the message, and it's like, wow, this is, I mean, Facebook and Instagram are big multinational corporations, but there is some good in what they allow us to do as far as activism goes, and as far as motivation and inspiration goes. And yeah, it's made my life as an artist, it's made my career as an artist possible, I guess, to have a platform where I can have an exhibition every day and reach people who are looking for that sort of inspiration every single day.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I'm wondering about words, because so my listeners are nature journalers, and in nature journaling we use words and pictures and numbers, and I'm interested in your thoughts on the power of combining words and pictures, because there's something extra that you can't get with either of those two things by themselves. When you put them together, there's magic that happens.
What creatives really do well is interpret information and images and, you know, phrases, interpret input in novel ways. So bringing together a song lyric from like a 90s Britney Spears hit with a message around climate change or local food movements is something that doesn't happen that often. But in illustration, I can bring those two together, and it's that tension and synchronicity that make us laugh and relate to it, and think of a friend who has a garden but who was also around when Britney Spears is playing at the clubs, and you know, it's that novel combination that really gives a new take on old issues. And so that's what I try to do. Or, you know, what would probably make my life easier is to just sit down and brainstorm a whole bunch of catchy quotes and then just draw illustrations to them. I never got better that way. It's probably all that needs to be done. Now I'm thinking about it. But taking, you know, a quote from a book and having a different slant on it, something that you maybe wouldn't expect, has a similar potential. And, you know, just seeing the quote can be inspiring, but seeing the quote with the image is like a whole other layer again.
Yeah, and your images are so colourful, and so I just feel really happy when I'm engaging with your images online. And yeah, I think that you're amazing.
Thanks, Bethan. I wanted to say something about nature journaling too.
Yes, I was going to ask you.
So I'm currently, I've just moved to WA and we're going to build, so I'm currently house sitting. But before I moved over here, I was at Meliadora for 4 years. I kept a nature journal at Meliadora for 3 of those years. And so every month I'd go out into the garden and record everything I could see that afternoon in drawings and in text. And, you know, it's fascinating to look back. It was like this time lapse of, oh, that was a really dry summer when the dam was fully dry for the first time in the 35 years I've had that property. Oh, but last summer was really wet, and so the dam just never really went down at all. And that's when the goats had babies, and now look, the babies are grown up. And it's just a beautiful way to connect with the world around you and to kind of curate a pattern literacy. You know, we grow up in our little boxes and drive our cars to our offices and separate ourselves artificially from the natural world that we're actually a part of. We're actually animals that live in a natural world.
That's right.
But we've forgotten this, and, you know, it has all sorts of repercussions around mental and physical health, and how we relate to each other. But if we start listening to the natural world, if we start looking, if we're recording it, if we're drawing it, writing about it, photographing it, collecting feathers and leaves, we're engaging again with the pattern understanding that land-based peoples had and still have in many parts of the world. And they're patterns like seasons, like the sun, the moon. They're patterns like the stars, but they're also patterns like leaf shape, edible plants. What weeds can I go out and harvest today?
Yes.
What mushrooms are edible? What mushrooms are medicinal? What what microclimates will certain plants grow in, what's happening with the water, is it a healthy system, is it not? These are all patterns that land-based peoples understand and that we can start to appreciate through nature journaling. So I love that this podcast has that focus. It's one of my real passions.
That's amazing. I loved your work before, and then I saw your segment on Gardening Australia and you had your nature journal, and I was, I was so excited to see that. And it made me think, because in permaculture, it's really important they focus on, before you put something in, before you make a change, to do a lot of observation. And nature journaling is really focused on observation. And so when you're doing a permaculture design, they say, well, ideally a year of observing, which is, I always thought that was really ambitious. Like, how would you gather enough time to do a year of observation? But they say that you should observe the sun in different seasons and all the different patterns and visitors, animal visitors and all that stuff. And I thought a nature journal would be absolutely perfect for that period of observing before making changes in a permaculture system.
I think on the note of the 1 year of observation, I think that's quite liberating for people who arrive in a new spot and have kids and work and lives and think, there's no way I can get started right now. So if a year suits you, go with it. It might be 3 or 4 years. It might be more. No judgment. You're just observing. Without a jail-free card.
Yeah. I'm actually doing permaculture.
Yeah. It might look like I'm sitting around drawing in the sunshine, but I'm hard at work.
I love that.
There's ways, of course, that we can shortcut that year as well. So when we talk about design in permaculture, holistic design, it's really about observing what's there. So if we're designing our block of land, and keep in mind that's one thing we can design. We can also design community projects. We can design intentional communities. We can design our work-life balance. But if we're doing a land-based design and say it's on our piece of land, we want to observe everything that's there. And the permaculture course really walks us through all of the things that we can know about, and stuff like, what's our soil like? Is there runoff from our neighbour's property when it rains? Is there a slope? Where does the sun rise and set? And so a lot of these things we can really gain an appreciation of after living at a site for a few years. But also, if you've just purchased a site or just moved back to your parents' place and want to give it a new life, or if you're hanging with a friend who's got 2 acres somewhere and doesn't know what to do with it, you want to give it a go, then you can find the sun angles online. You don't have to wait for a whole year. You can find the wind patterns online through the Bureau of Meteorology. You can walk the site over and over and find out where the good soil is. Maybe if there's good soil and it's kind of flat and it gets good sun access in the wintertime, maybe that's where you want to put your garden. So permaculture design talks about this design literacy, this engaging with the natural world and making kind of the best decisions that we can make so that we avoid making expensive mistakes and planning a house that faces west with no eaves and a black roof, and that we really need, you really need air conditioning all summer just to survive in your house. We don't want houses like that. We want to face north in Australia so we get winter sun but not summer sun. So that's what part of what permaculture's on about. I've deviated from the question. I can't remember what it was anymore.
I was thinking that, no, that's fine. I was thinking just that in that observation stage, nature journaling would be a really helpful tool.
Yeah, it's, were permaculture brought to the masses by different people, I would imagine it would be a crucial element of any permaculture design course. So I'm going to take that with me, and next time I'm teaching, I just came back from a permaculture course yesterday. Next time I'm teaching on one in a couple of months, I think that's a really great recommendation. There's no better way to get to know the place around you than by sitting and listening and watching and drawing.
Yeah, and observation is it's one of the keys, I feel, to nature journaling. And I just love that deep sitting, that deep observing, well, it's just connection. I say this all the time because I teach nature journaling, and I just find myself saying connection with yourself, connection with land, connection with other people. But that's what it's all about. Yeah, exciting.
And it's, as far as seasonal changes goes, it's not always something that we can hold in our mind.
Exactly.
When were the strawberries ready? When did the tree lose its leaves? When were the bees up in the eucalypts having a great time? And it also changes from year to year. So it's quite a long-term project to curate that seasonal literacy. But if we're recording it in some way, then we can look back and see the patterns emerging.
Yeah, that's cool. One day my son and I were reading a book that we'd got from the library, and I was turning the pages and I thought, I know those characters. And it was The Bee Detectives, a book that you've illustrated. And yeah, I just love this book so much. And I wanted to ask you about, you can talk a little bit about The Bee Detectives because it's such a cool book. And I also wanted to know about like what you feel about reaching kids. You know, we could talk a lot about these issues, but the kids are the foundation, I feel. And I wonder about your thoughts on reaching kids and raising kids that are connected with nature and gardens and community.
Well, yeah, so Bee Detectives was released early this year by CSIRO Publishing, and the author is Vanessa Ryan Rendell, who's a librarian and educator, and so good at writing for kids. She's got the knack. We all think, oh, I could do that, but some people actually do it really well, and she's one of them. So it's a story about a couple of kids that end up with a native bee hive, sugar bag bees. They're one of the few native bees that actually live in colonies like honeybees do, and they also produce honey, albeit a lot slower than honeybees. But they go on an adventure through their garden learning about all the other kinds of native bees that are there. And so I've tried to bring that, you know, CSIRO publishes science books for kids and adults, tried to bring this science book to life and make it as engaging as possible, which was an interesting challenge and one that CSIRO, they generally do beautifully as a publishing house.
Yes.
So, yes, kids are the future. I teach adults and children. We've had a few school incursion programs lately where I was teaching about soil science, which is really great. And, you know, the tendency is to think, oh, if adults have a certain understanding of a topic, then kids will probably understand a little less, being 20, 30, 40 years younger. But actually, on the big issues of our time, I have been blown away by the sophistication and the nuanced understanding that kids have on climate change, deforestation, what have you. So when we're doing these school shows, I realised that we really need to up our game. Kids understand more than the adults who are supposedly teaching them. And, you know, climate education just wasn't really a thing in the 1990s. It was when I was at school. It was pick up your recycling and clean up Australia, and that was about it. Whereas kids now, wow, they're learning so much. So I've put a lot of energy into educational tools, and but, you know, we've got posters and card decks and these sorts of things to help people explore these issues in a way that, you know, using my characters and some song lyrics from the wonderful permaculture band, Formidable Vegetable. We've collaborated on a few tools, which you can check out my website if you're interested, to help the conversation around these issues with kids be more lively and exciting. Just like in the Bee Detectives book, we're not saying, oh, our native bees are in danger and dying out and blah, blah, blah. We're saying, hey, plant a bunch of flowers. Hey, learn how to identify them. Hey, engage with the issue. It's really exciting. And once you're engaged, then you can act on it. So we in our work at schools talk about the same thing with climate change and social justice and the other big issues. You know, let's not focus on what's wrong because everyone has that in their back pocket, but let's talk about exciting solutions-focused work. And, you know, kids are all over that stuff. You show how to build a worm farm and then they're building it up to their armpits in worm castings and having the best time. So I've got a lot of hope for this next generation.
Yeah, I love the idea of using art and books and music, especially to engage kids with these issues, because I have been walking this line with my son who, you know, we want our kids to be responsible citizens. We want them to have an eco-consciousness. And yet I don't want to put stuff on him. I don't want to burden him. He's a baby. And so being solutions focused, being engaged, like you say, I love this word, and being active and focusing on solutions rather than problems. I think this is a really positive thing to do, because we don't want to burden our kids, but we do want them to have an awareness.
And I remember back in primary school wanting to know what could be done. And
yes.
the generation teaching me, they just didn't have the answer. So it was just, recycling, that's all that can be done. And I'm thinking, no, it doesn't match up with the severity of the issues that we're facing here.
Yeah.
And then you get people like Greta Thunberg who say that, she felt the same way.
Yeah.
And now there's a lot that kids can do. It's not only, they've got their school gardens, but they've also got so many different kinds of protests. And we had a concert locally a couple of days ago. It's kind of like a multi-school Eisteddfod thing. It was big in southwest Western Australia. And there's one local school the song that they sang was about compost toilets.
Yes.
And saving why are we flushing fresh water? Why are we flushing all that nutrient out to become waste and pollution somewhere else when we could be cycling it around, composting it down and using it on the fruit trees to grow food? And that's a radical act. It's also something that wouldn't have happened 10, 20 years ago. But we're at this time of great change where people are enacting their form of activism, and to watch a school group get up and sing something that's uncomfortable for some people and new information for others and old information for others, these sorts of practices, these land-based sensible practices have been done and are still being done by different cultures all over the world. It makes me so excited, right? There's no taboos anymore. We've just got to try things and be radical in our own way and bring everybody else along with us as we go.
I love also that kids are so quick to pull up adults as well. So my son and I, we were talking about waste and reducing waste, and we did a bit of a rubbish audit for ourselves, and we looked through the recycling bin and what we were using, and we found that whatever we were using most of, we said, how can we reduce that? And then if I go to buy something that we talked about during that just one waste audit together, he tells me off and he says, we need to reduce that.
We should make our own crackers or whatever.
Exactly. And they have this strong sense of what's right and wrong, and without burdening them, but like empowering him to say, we can make a different choice. This is going to make rubbish and we don't want rubbish. So what could we do instead of that? And he's just taken that right on board, and he pulls me up, which I think is really fantastic.
There was a school story I heard a few months ago, a school that had an issue with parents idling their car in the pickup line. It was causing all this localised pollution as well as, the other issues. And so the kids took it upon themselves to become car monitors and just tap on the window and say, did you know by idling your car you're contributing to climate change? Would you mind turning your car off? And what parent could say no to that?
Yes, you can't say no. That's amazing. I love that.
You could unleash a swarm of kids on any issue, really.
Brenna, could you talk about how people can find you and engage with you? And especially I'd love for you to talk about your Patreon page, because I think Patreon's a really wonderful way for us to support artists. But I'd love for you to tell the listeners how they can find you online.
So to see my Art as Activism artworks, head to Brenna Quinlan on Facebook or Instagram. To see my house build, my straw bale permaculture house build, which is just getting started, head to Grow Do It on all the channels, including YouTube. And I've got a website, brennaquinlan.com, where you can check out my educational resources through my shop. I've got things on ferments, on harvesting weeds, and some cool permaculture educational resources there as well as all the books we've talked about today. And Patreon, it's a monthly subscription service, or you can choose to give donations either every month or a lump sum. And for people like me, it makes the world of a difference. So it means that I can say, if Coca-Cola knocks on my door and says, Brenna, do me a drawing, I can say, no thanks.
Nah, I've got my patrons.
if you work on your ethics and become an active force for good in the world, let's talk. But until now, I'm just sticking to my ethics, and I'm only going to create art for causes that are actively working to benefit the world. So Patreon gives me a bit of financial security so that I can make those choices, and so I can make all these free resources for everybody that I release online.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for being here. It's been a real joy to chat with you.
Thanks, Bethan. It's been great.
I hope you've enjoyed this conversation with Brenna and that it has left you with a sense that your actions can make a difference in this world. The thing I feel when I engage with Brenna's work is that the future can be bright. Yes, we will need to adapt and change, but the changes that we make will bring about more joy, more connection, and stronger communities. It will involve growing fresh food and sharing skills and connecting with others, and all this makes us stronger and more resilient during times of crisis like we're in right now. I feel very inspired right now, and I hope you do too. Thank you so much for listening. See you next week.